A big moment this weekend at Lakewood Church as a new generation begins to take center stage. Jonathan Osteen spoke at Saturday and Sunday services. He is the son of Joel and Victoria Osteen.
The cameras are always on at Lakewood Church. That is not a metaphor, it is a logistical fact. Tens of thousands of people flood that former sports arena every Sunday, and millions more watch from home. And every angle is covered, every smile is captured, every moment of Joel Osteen lifting his Bible above his head is recorded, archived, broadcast, and replayed. The machine never stops. But here is the question that almost nobody thinks to ask. What does a child see when the cameras are finally off? What does a boy grow up knowing about a father who is, to the outside world, the living symbol of God's abundance? And what happens when that boy becomes a man and starts to speak? Jonathan Osteen did not set out to tear anything down, but what he has said and what he has left unsaid and the spaces between the two, those spaces tell a story that Lakewood's production team cannot edit. Let's establish what most people think they know, because the mythology here is thick. Joel Osteen is the smiling pastor, the prosperity gospel preacher, the man who took his father's modest Houston congregation and turned it into the largest church in America. He is the man who wrote a book called Your Best Life Now and sold millions of copies. He is the man who lives in a $10 million mansion and tells struggling people that God wants them to be wealthy. He is the man who, according to multiple reports, initially declined to open Lakewood's doors to Hurricane Katrina refugees in 2005, doors to a building that seats 16,000 people before public pressure forced a reversal. He is the man who, during the COVID-19 pandemic, was reported to have kept church services open longer than public health guidance recommended, and whose church later received a federal Paycheck Protection loan estimated at between $4 and $5 million, a fact that generated enormous controversy given Lakewood's reported annual revenues of somewhere around $90 million. That is the public file. That is what the critics say. But none of that is the heart of this story. The heart of this story is a son. Jonathan Osteen is Joel's eldest child, born into a world where the church was not something the family attended, it was something the family was. His grandfather, John Osteen, founded Lakewood in 1959 out of a converted feed store in Houston, Texas. His father grew up in that world, eventually became its most famous product, and then when John Osteen died unexpectedly of a heart attack in January 1999, Joel stepped into the pulpit almost despite himself. A man who had no formal theological training, who had spent years running the church's television production ministry, who had reportedly never even preached a sermon before his father's death. Within 6 years, Lakewood was in the former Compaq Center. Within a decade, Joel Osteen was a global brand. Jonathan watched all of this happen from the inside. He watched it as a child who sat in the front row, not because he chose to, but because that is where the pastor's family sits. He watched it as a teenager in a household where spiritual performance was not separate from family life, it was the architecture of family life. He watched it as a young man who bore a famous last name in a city where that name meant something very specific: abundance, optimism, the theology of the smile. And then, as an adult, Jonathan Osteen began to emerge publicly, began to preach, began to speak about his own faith journey. And in doing so, he revealed, carefully, selectively, but unmistakably, that the view from inside was not identical to the view from outside. Here is the detail almost everyone misses. Jonathan has not gone rogue, he has not written a tell-all, he has not appeared on a podcast to burn his father's reputation to the ground. What he has done is quieter and in some ways more revealing. He has talked about pressure. He has talked about identity. He has talked in his own measured way about what it costs a person, what it costs a child, to grow up inside an institution that is also a family, inside a brand that is also a faith, inside a performance that never, ever stops. To understand what Jonathan is navigating, you have to understand what prosperity gospel actually is, because it is not simply optimism with a Bible verse attached. Prosperity theology, sometimes called the health and wealth gospel or the name it and claim it movement, is the theological position that financial blessing and physical health are the will of God for believers, and that faith, expressed through prayer, through positive confession, and critically through financial giving to the church, is the mechanism by which that blessing is released. It is a theology with deep roots in American religious history, tracing back through figures like Oral Roberts and Kenneth Hagin and Kenneth Copeland. And it reached its cultural apex in the figure of Joel Osteen, who stripped away much of the explicitly charismatic framework and repackaged the core idea in the language of self-help, motivation, and relentless positivity. The critics of this theology are numerous and credentialed and consistent. They argue that it exploits the vulnerable, that it tells poor people their poverty is a faith deficit, that it redirects money from struggling congregants toward enriching already wealthy church leaders, that it creates a closed loop of magical thinking that insulates the believer from confronting material reality. And, they argue, this is the part that matters for this story, they argue that it creates a specific kind of emotional environment inside the families of its leaders. An environment where admitting doubt is not just personally uncomfortable, it is theologically dangerous. Where saying, "I am struggling" is, within the logic of the belief system, a confession of insufficient faith. Where the performance of blessing is not optional, it is doctrinal. Imagine growing up in that house. Imagine being Joel Osteen's son on a day when everything feels hard. When school is difficult, when friendships are complicated, when you feel the ordinary weight of being human, and knowing that in your family's theological framework, the correct response to that weight is to speak positively over it, to confess abundance, to reject the negative report, not because your parents are cruel, but because that is genuinely and sincerely what they believe. The armor of positivity is not a mask in the Osteen household, it is the foundation of the faith itself. Jonathan Osteen has spoken in interviews and sermons about the pressure of his upbringing, about the weight of expectation, about the challenge of forming a personal faith identity separate from his father's enormous institutional one. He has described moments of real spiritual searching, of not simply inheriting his father's version of belief, but having to find his own. He has spoken about the difficulty of stepping into ministry while carrying a last name that is, globally, synonymous with a very specific theological brand. These are not explosive accusations, but read carefully. Read between the lines of what a man raised in that environment is willing to say publicly, and the picture that emerges is one of a young man who spent years quietly negotiating between what the institution required of him and what his interior life actually looked like. But here is where the story deepens, because Jonathan's experience cannot be separated from the broader pattern of what Lakewood Church has looked like when the cameras do turn off. In 2019, Victoria Osteen, Joel's wife, Jonathan's mother, and co-pastor of Lakewood, faced renewed scrutiny over a 2014 incident that had originally occurred years earlier. In 2005, she had been removed from a Continental Airlines flight after an altercation with a flight attendant, Sharon Brown. Brown later sued Victoria Osteen, alleging that Victoria had been belligerent, had pushed her, and had caused emotional distress. The civil jury did not award Brown the full damages she sought, finding that while a battery had occurred, the damages were limited. Victoria Osteen denied the characterizations, but the episode, a wealthy, prominent pastor's wife behaving badly toward a service worker on a commercial flight, became a flashpoint for critics who saw it as precisely the kind of behavior that prosperity gospel's theology of entitlement could produce. The lawsuit was ultimately decided in limited favor of Brown on one count, though the larger claims were rejected. Jonathan was a child when that incident occurred. He grew up in a household where that kind of public scrutiny was a constant backdrop, where his family's behavior was subject to national examination, where the gap between public ministry and private humanity was not abstract, it was breakfast table real. Stop here for a moment, because there is a version of this story that is easy and wrong. The easy version is, Joel Osteen is a fraud, his church is a money machine, his theology is harmful, and his son has now exposed him. That version is satisfying in a certain way, and it has the advantage of being partly true. The theology is contested and, by the account of many serious biblical scholars, deeply problematic. The wealth accumulation is real and documented and genuinely difficult to reconcile with the teachings of the New Testament on its face. The Hurricane Katrina episode remains a damaging part of the record, whatever the full context may have been. But that easy version flattens Jonathan Osteen into a weapon aimed at his father, and Jonathan himself has not chosen that role. He continues to preach at Lakewood. He has expressed love for his father and for the church. He is not a rebel. He is something more complicated and, ultimately, more revealing. He is a person formed by a particular world who is working, publicly and carefully, to find the parts of that formation he can keep and the parts he needs to examine. And what he is examining, by speaking about identity and pressure and the weight of inherited faith, is the question that the smiling cameras of Lakewood have never been designed to ask. What does it cost to live inside the performance? To answer that, you have to look at the institution itself with clearer eyes. Lakewood Church does not publish detailed financial disclosures because, as a religious organization, it is not legally required to. This is a fact that its critics find troubling and its defenders find irrelevant. What is known from reporting by outlets including the Houston Chronicle and others is that the church's estimated annual income has been reported in the range of approximately $70 to $90 million or more, drawn from tithing, offerings, and an extensive media and product ecosystem that includes books, music, television broadcasts, and speaking engagements. Joel Osteen's personal wealth has been estimated by various sources at somewhere between $40 and $100 million, figures that he has at various points disputed or declined to address directly. His compensation from the church has been described in his own statements as something he does not take or takes minimally because his book revenues are sufficient. Whether or not those specific numbers are precise, the broader reality is not seriously disputed. Joel Osteen is an extraordinarily wealthy man who built that wealth on the platform of a religious institution funded by the donations of ordinary people, many of whom are not wealthy, many of whom came to Lakewood or watched from home precisely because the message told them that God wanted to bless them financially, that their giving was an act of faith that would return to them multiplied. Jonathan grew up knowing all of this. He grew up knowing where the money came from and what was promised in exchange for it, and what that transaction looked like from the inside of the family it enriched. There is a specific moment in Jonathan Osteen's public record that deserves careful attention, because it encapsulates everything this story is actually about. In various interviews and ministry appearances, Jonathan has spoken about the experience of finding his own voice, his own call, his own relationship with faith, separate from the institutional gravity of his father's ministry. He has described the process as one of genuine struggle, not theatrical humility. He has spoken about feeling the weight of a last name that carries enormous expectation. He has spoken about the challenge of being loved for what your family represents rather than for who you actually are. He has spoken, in short, about the experience of growing up inside a brand and the particular loneliness that produces. This is the detail the cameras were never designed to capture, the loneliness at the center of the spectacle. The boy in the front row who cannot simply be uncertain, because uncertainty, in the theology his family leads, carries a different kind of cost than it does for other children. For most children, doubt is developmentally normal. For the pastor's son at Lakewood Church, doubt is complicated in ways that most people will never understand, because it is not just personal, it is public, it is institutional. It is, in the specific logic of prosperity gospel, it requires a very specific emotional performance from its leaders, and by extension, from the families of its leaders. It requires the constant projection of blessing. It requires that suffering, when it appears, be immediately reframed as a season, as a test, as something God is using for a higher purpose, not as a genuine encounter with loss or darkness or the limits of human control. This is not cruelty. For many sincere believers within this tradition, it is a genuine and sustaining faith. But as a psychological environment, it creates conditions that are worth examining honestly. When you grow up in a home where the correct spiritual posture towards suffering is to speak positively over it, what happens to the suffering itself? Where does it go? When you grow up in a home where doubt cannot be expressed freely because doubt itself is framed as a spiritual problem, what happens to the doubts? When you grow up in a home where the public face of the family is a product, carefully managed, broadcast globally, inseparable from your identity, what happens to the private face? Jonathan Osteen's careful, measured public navigation of his own faith identity is, read charitably, the answer to those questions. He is showing us in real time what it looks like to find private truth inside a world built on public performance. Look at this from another angle. From the outside, the Osteen family represents everything their theology promises. They are attractive, successful, wealthy, confident, and perpetually smiling. They are the proof of concept. If God blesses the faithful, the Osteens are Exhibit A. And that is precisely what makes their position so psychologically complex, because you cannot be the proof of concept and simultaneously be allowed to struggle. You cannot be the advertisement and also be the fine print. Jonathan's careful public words, his discussions of pressure, of identity, of the search for authentic faith are, in this reading, the fine print. They are what happens when the son of the advertisement grows up and discovers that he is also a person, with a person's complications, with a person's doubts, with a person's need to be known for something other than what the institution needs him to be. That is not an accusation. It is, if anything, humanizing. But it is also, if you read it clearly, an exposure of the cost. Not the cost of fraud, not the cost of malice, the cost of a world where the performance never stops, where the cameras are always on, where God's favor is measured in square footage and television ratings, and where a child has to grow up figuring out, privately, what is real. The question of what is real has followed Lakewood Church through its most controversial moments, and those moments are worth examining not as a political attack on Joel Osteen, but as a kind of diagnostic, a series of incidents that reveal, each time, the gap between the institution's stated values and its observed behavior. The Hurricane Katrina episode in 2005 is the most frequently cited. When Katrina devastated New Orleans and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, Lakewood Church, then newly installed in the former Compaq Center, a facility with seating capacity for 16,000 people, initially did not open its doors as a shelter. The reasons given at the time were logistical and security-related. Victoria Osteen, in one account, suggested that the family had been told by city officials to stand by. Joel Osteen made several television appearances in which he expressed sympathy and indicated the church would help once called upon by authorities. Critics were not satisfied. The image of the nation's largest megachurch sitting empty while people drowned became a defining moment in the public perception of prosperity gospel's relationship to suffering. Lakewood did eventually open as a shelter, and the church and the Osteens did contribute to relief efforts. But the initial hesitation, whatever its logistical explanation, became a symbol of something that critics argued was structural. A theology that frames poverty and disaster as potential spiritual failures is a theology that is poorly equipped to simply open its doors to the suffering without conditions or commentary. Jonathan was a teenager when that happened. The COVID-19 pandemic produced another round of scrutiny. Lakewood's approach to in-person services during the early pandemic drew criticism from public health advocates, though the church's specific timeline of actions was disputed by its representatives. The revelation that Lakewood had received a federal PPP loan, a program designed to help small businesses and nonprofits retain employees during the economic shutdown, in an amount reported to be between $4 and $5 million, struck many observers as deeply incongruous for an institution reporting revenues in the tens of millions annually. The church defended the loan as legitimate and used for staff salaries. Critics argued that a church with Lakewood's financial resources taking pandemic relief money intended for struggling small businesses was, at minimum, a serious failure of the moral imagination. And then there was the moment, reported across multiple outlets in 2022, when Houston experienced a severe winter storm and water pipes froze across the city, leaving residents without heat or safe water for days. Social media footage appeared to show Joel Osteen traveling or otherwise absent from Houston during the crisis. The church disputed the characterization, stating that Osteen was in the city and that Lakewood was actively providing assistance. The optics, regardless of the facts, were not good. For a pastor whose brand is the promise of God's provision, images, accurate or not, of absence during a community crisis hit with particular force. Each of these incidents, taken alone, can be contextualized, disputed, or explained. Taken together, they describe a pattern in which the institution's first instinct when the cameras are not broadcasting its Sunday best is self-protective. A pattern in which the gap between the theology's promises and the institution's actions becomes visible precisely at the moments of real-world pressure. Jonathan Osteen has watched all of this. He has watched it from the front row, from the family dinner table, from the private corridors of the institution his family built. Here is what we do not know, and honesty requires us to say so. We do not know the full content of Jonathan Osteen's private views about his father, his church, or the theology he was raised in. We do not know what conversations happen behind those closed doors that he has, in careful and measured public appearances, indicated are complicated. We do not know whether his navigation of his own faith identity represents a quiet critique, a genuine embrace with modifications, or something more complex than either. He has not said. He continues to preach at Lakewood. He has not broken publicly with his father. He has not denounced the institution or the theology. What he has done, and this is where the title of this story earns its weight, is exist publicly as a person who was formed by that world and who is visibly, carefully working to understand what that formation means. His willingness to speak about pressure, about identity, about the search for authenticity within inherited faith in the context of an institution that is not designed to welcome those questions is itself a kind of testimony. Not a legal one, not an accusation, but a testimony nonetheless. The deepest question this story raises is not about Joel Osteen's wealth, or his theology, or his church's tax-exempt status, though all of those questions are legitimate and worth asking. The deepest question is about what it means to build a world, an institution, a theology, a brand, a family on the promise of endless blessing, and what happens to the people who live inside that world when the blessing is complicated by ordinary human reality. Jonathan Osteen is not simply his father's son. He is a person who grew up in a world where the rules of spiritual and emotional life were shaped by a very specific theological and institutional logic. A logic that rewards performance, that frames suffering as a failure of faith, that conflates God's favor with financial and material success, and that broadcasts the family's life to millions of people every week. That is an extraordinary environment to grow up in, and the fact that he is now, as an adult, speaking openly about the complexity of that experience, the pressure, the identity questions, the work of finding authentic faith inside an inherited framework is significant precisely because the institution he came from is not built to encourage those questions. That is what he saw behind closed doors. Not necessarily scandal in the legal or criminal sense, something perhaps more revealing than that. The gap, the space between the broadcast and the reality, the distance between the smile and the silence behind it. And perhaps that is the most honest account of what Prosperity Gospel's most famous family actually produced. Not a rebel, not a whistleblower, not a simple apologist, but a son working quietly and publicly to locate the real inside the performed, to find the private inside the broadcast, to become a person inside a brand. The cameras at Lakewood are still on. They will broadcast again next Sunday. The smiles will be confident, the music will be polished, the message will be, as it has always been, that God wants you blessed, that your best life is available, that faith is the key. But in the careful, measured, quietly searching words of Jonathan Osteen, something else is also being said. Something the cameras are not quite designed to capture but cannot entirely prevent. The view from inside is not the same as the view from outside. The boy in the front row saw something, and now the man is finding his words. What those words mean fully, that story is still being written.